to everybody and happy Wednesday. We do not usually hold events that late, but today we're bringing to the table a hot topic, the Ukraine crisis, and we have the pleasure to have with us Dr. Maha Aziz to talk about it. And I really want to acknowledge that Dr. Maha is in Dubai right now, so for her it's 5 a.m. in the morning. It's good morning for her, and we truly appreciate her time and her willingness to join us today. My name is Daisy Flores. I am the programming manager of the Ambassador Series in New York of Young Professionals in Foreign Policy, also known as YPFP. Raquel.
My name is Raquel Narvajas, and I am the programming director in New York. YPFP works to build the leaders tomorrow needs. We do this by providing YPFP members with capacity building programs, engaging events, a global community of peers, and opportunities to elevate their voices through writing and publication.
Thank you, Raquel. Before I introduce Dr. Aziz, I have few administrative items. If you have any questions, please submit them using the chat function at the bottom right of your screen. YPFP staff will organize the questions and pass them along to Dr. Aziz. Please remain on mute throughout the conversation in order to reduce background noise. And this session is going to be recorded, as you can see, and we will publish it in our social media so you can watch it as many times as you want. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Aziz, who has generously partnered with us to talk about this important topic. Dr. Aziz is a professor, author, speaker, and cartoonist. She investigates global risk and future trends in her own work as a professor of the Master International Relations program at the New York University's Frederick School of Arts and Science. She's a risk expert at the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on frontier risks. And she's also a keynote speaker to corporations, governments, and at conferences worldwide. She's also an author of 2 books and a comic book, best-selling 7-time award-winning book on global risk, Future World Order, released in 2020. And there is an upcoming book called Global Spring that is going to be released this year, plus an award-winning book, a political comic book called The Global Kid that has been released last year. Dr. Aziz, welcome. We truly appreciate having you here, and thank you. I give you the floor.
Thank you so much, Stacey. It's great to connect with you all. Yes, it is 5 a.m. here in Dubai. I'm here on spring break. I'm seeing my family after 2 years, in fact, so it's been really nice, and also to get some sun. The last time I spoke to the YPF community was probably just at the start of the pandemic. It was to do with the COVID effect and how that would reshape our world order. Obviously, a lot has changed in the last 2 years, and it's easy to forget lately about what's happening with respect to the pandemic. There are still, in fact, over 2 million cases. In the last day, there have been 2 million new cases with respect to COVID. But obviously, we need to reshape or reorient our thinking to consider how the Ukraine crisis, which is so significant, as I'm sure you know, to think about how that will affect our world order going forward. As you may know, I focus on the end at the World Economic Forum. I'm on the Future Council, and the basic idea is to identify global risks, the threats to our stability, what could go wrong, what is going wrong today, and how could those risks further in the coming. We cannot ignore what's happening in Ukraine. Should we have seen this coming? Should we have seen the Ukraine crisis coming, or rather Putin's decision to invade? We probably should have. And there were quite a few analysts in months before the suggested this was going to happen. And frankly, if you look back at President Putin's rhetoric in the last few years, and really since the 2014 invasion of Crimea, this was inevitable. But I think given current global risk trends, this really created the perfect opportunity, unfortunately, for President Putin of Russia to take this aggressive action. I can't imagine he expected the worldwide response at the level of the state, at the level of non-state actors, average citizens. So it's really been remarkable to observe how this has unfolded. But I want to talk about Ukraine in a more structured way. Let's applying a global risk lens and looking at how this will impact geopolitics, our politics, our economy, and our society. And then after that, I'm happy to take a few questions. So let's structure our thinking. If we are reflecting on geopolitics or geopolitical risk, in a sense, Putin's invasion is in keeping with global geopolitical risk trends. The basic idea being that we have not had clear leadership in over a decade. There's been a lack of clarity about who's in charge. If you reflect, and I know it's hard to remember the pre-COVID era, but if you reflect on the pre-COVID era, there was ongoing speculation that was challenging the hegemony of the US as a global power. We speculated about the decline of the US, or to what extent China was filling that gap. Sorry, mosquito. Whether China was filling that gap, or whether the world order was going to be defined by US versus China, or if this was simply a multipolar world. And I think a lot of that discussion was still relevant during the COVID era, when the pandemic began, and even in the years since. It's been 2 years now this month. It's been fairly clear that we don't have US or global leadership, right? We did not unite against the common enemy of COVID-19 in the way that we should have. And we did not see a significant united global response, leadership from the G7, the G20 in the way that we should have seen. And of course, I'm sure you're aware that during this period of the pandemic, there was a significant effort by China and China's leadership to lead the world through COVID diplomacy. First, it was with masks, then it was with vaccines. Obviously, that has had mixed results, and we know there's a renewed lockdown, unfortunately, in China, resurgence in the pandemic there as well. But what was interesting to note before we get into the Putin effect is that during this period of a lack of leadership in the pandemic, which reflected the previous years as well, the pre-COVID years as well, we did see other types of actors try to fill the gap. Non-state actors. I'm sure you're aware that there are many billionaires in the world, and we saw everyone from Bill Gates to Adrian Chang to Jack Ma, Elon Musk, try to lead the way and help deal with the pandemic because of the crisis of leadership at the level of the state. Okay, our world leaders did not manage to lead the way. And these billionaires offered masks, they offered support on the vaccine, they even offered ventilators. That was Elon Musk, who I'm actually a big fan of, with regards to Ukraine as well, which we'll talk about. So that was definitely an interesting trend to observe, this resurgence in the non-state actor in terms of the activist billionaire during the pandemic. Now we are in a new era, okay? Even if the pandemic is ongoing, we are not officially in a post-pandemic era. We now have President Putin has sort of unleashed this new era, this invasion effect, or whatever you want to call it. And what's positive is to see, unlike with COVID, we've seen that the world community has come together with respect to military and humanitarian support, particularly the US, UK, Canada, EU. In fact, this is the first time in the EU's history that they have become a real geopolitical player by offering military aid. That is significant. We've seen perhaps, and this could be a silver lining, this renewed support or appreciation for international law, international norms in reaction to what President Putin has done in invading Ukraine. We've also seen benefits like cryptocurrency. There's no turning back. The genie's out of the bottle. We've seen that during wartime, cryptocurrency can be a huge added value. Over, I think the last I checked just yesterday, over 60 million perhaps has been given by a cryptocurrency, including, I think somebody gave an NFT, one of those Bored Ape NFTs to support Ukraine. I think that will be, that's an interesting trend to observe. And that's for you all as young professionals in foreign policy to see how this will play out in the next crisis. We've also seen, again, a big role for the activist billionaire Elon Musk after being, after receiving a tweet from the foreign minister of Ukraine for support, has sent his Starlink satellite internet so that there is uninterrupted internet access for the Ukraine government and the Ukrainians during this sensitive period. And it's been a game changer that the government has been able to share the message, their message, and what's happening there with the world, thanks to social media. So big tech perhaps has come to our rescue, although of course there's a lot of concern to what extent big tech has selectively shown support for these sort of global challenges. They didn't do enough when state-sponsored groups were promoting hate speech against the Rohingyas. They're helping here in the context of Ukraine, banning Russian state media propaganda, and so forth. So it's interesting to see how these trends are playing out. My concern is that this unity that we're seeing on a global stage, and just yesterday, I believe Zelensky gave a pretty emotional speech to the Congress and directly telling Biden, to support the efforts there more. And there was another major speech given to the European Parliament that left some of the listeners in tears. All thanks to the internet access and social media. But will this unity be sustainable? I guess my concern as a global risk specialist is perhaps this unity will be short-lived, especially as we transition to other global challenges. I mean, everyone knows about COP26 and the pledges that were made there. I'm not sure we'll see the same sort of commitment from the global community or world leaders to tackle these other issues. And what I envision we will continue to see this trend because of this crisis of global leadership and this short-lived unity is that this era, this post-pandemic, post-invasion era, will return to a similar type of government structure or political structure in the international system, where it's defined by great power competition in a leaderless world. And I think there are three elements in play already, which will become more prominent as the months go on. Of course, US and the West versus Russia. We're seeing that right now with respect to what's happening in Ukraine. There's speculation about will this lead to nuclear conflict, which UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres claims is in the realm of possibility. We've also, of course, there's speculation about World War III, although, President Biden has been clear they will not send troops. There's also concern that in this period of great power competition, US and the West versus Russia, is this an opportunity for more conflict elsewhere? Are other actors, whether they're other superpower countries or rogue states, rogue actors, are they going to see the current focus of the Ukraine crisis as an opportunity to be more aggressive in their neighborhoods? And that's something that, again, you as foreign policy analysts should be monitoring as we get deeper into this crisis. Second, the other great power competition that is evolving in this leaderless world and that existed even before this began during the pre-COVID and COVID era, is of course the ongoing competition between US and China, the tech war, the trade wars, but there's a big question mark. What role is China playing right now with respect to supporting the Russians? And I think President Biden in the last 24 hours has said that, has warned the leadership of China that there'll be consequences if you support Russia in what they're doing. President Biden's rhetoric has also, in the last year, been very clear that his major agenda is to make sure China does not gain in power. And again, there's a concern that, is this an opportunity potentially for China to be more aggressive with respect to Taiwan while the world is focused on Ukraine? That is a real concern. And lastly, I think the biggest dynamic that's playing out and will evolve in the coming months and year in terms of great power competition in this leaderless world is US versus China and Russia. I'm sure you're aware that even before, this was just before the invasion, President Putin was in China and embracing his Chinese counterpart, and a very significant partnership was signed, a partnership with quote unquote no limits. And it's military, it's an economic partnership, and it's really unclear how this will play out, especially in light of Ukraine. I know that Russia has been very vocal about asking for China's leadership for support, but there's still, I don't think it's been clarified if China has offered that military support, but it has given Russia a financial lifeline, given that Western finances is being cut off as we speak in Russia. So the other significant point with respect to this partnership is that Russian and China leadership have been clear that they want to use this as an opportunity in a world lacking clear global leadership, or in a world where the US is not necessarily the global leader it once was, that this is an opportunity to potentially reshape the international order so it's not underpinned by liberal democratic values, which is what we saw in the post-Cold War era. So this is a very, the Putin's invasion is really in keeping with geopolitical risk in terms of this lack of global leadership, and these three great power competitions are sort of playing out. Who will win? It's very hard to predict. The situation is evolving as we speak, and maybe the war is over tomorrow, although I doubt it. But it's very difficult to determine in the short term who will sort of lead the way. But I think longer term, the superpower that will probably be leading the world will likely be the one with the best AI weaponry. But that's more of a long-term picture. So again, geopolitically, I think what's happening in Ukraine, and it's sort of and the role of these other powers, it's really in keeping with existing geopolitical risk trends, where we've not been clear on who's in charge, and traditional superpowers are not necessarily the ones leading the way. It's not a clear picture, and of course, I'll welcome your feedback on that. I think maybe we have one or two questions already. So that's what I would say about geopolitical risk in relation to Ukraine. I also want to touch on the political, economic, and social trends that have come into play or have been reinforced by Putin's actions. If we think about politics for a moment, and rather global political risk trends, what's happened in Ukraine, or Putin's decision to invade, is really in keeping with larger political trends of the last decade, post-Arab Spring, where we've seen this decline in political freedoms, this decline in democracy around the world. In fact, Freedom House has recently stated that this is the 15th year in which we've seen a steady decline in political freedoms around the world, in democracy. And frankly, it's, although President Biden has been vocal about wanting to re-engage with this foreign policy agenda of promoting democracy around the world, I know his heart is in the right place, but frankly, in other parts of the world, the perspective is more likely what gives the US the legitimacy to dictate or nudge other countries to be more democratic, given what we saw during the Trump years, given the ongoing political polarization that we are seeing in the US. Again, even if President Biden is, the other extreme in terms of character versus his predecessor, I'm not sure he will be able to regain that legitimacy to unite the US politically or to lead the charge on promoting democracy. So in this backdrop of a crisis of governance, a crisis of democracy around the world that's been building again for over a decade, and that's something I emphasize in my first book, Future World Order, it's not so shocking that President Putin would engage in this anti-democratic action. His major concern that he has vocalized in recent months and frankly in recent years is that he didn't want Ukraine to join NATO, but he also did not want a pro-democracy government in place in Ukraine. So we shouldn't be so shocked. I mean, there's so much speculation about or discussion about how this was such a shocking event, but it really is in keeping with the trends that we've already seen geopolitically and politically. And I would encourage you, again, as young professionals in foreign policy, to reflect on this fact that we've seen anti-government sentiment around the world against democracy and even non-democracies building in the last decade. And how do we reclaim political legitimacy? It's, at least in discussions I've had with policymakers, with other academics, there's been this question mark: is democracy as we know it the best system to meet 21st century challenges? So that just separate from Ukraine, I think that's you should certainly keep that in mind as you reflect on the world and make your judgments. But again, Putin's actions are anti-democratic actions. This desire to eradicate the growing democracy, relatively flourishing democracy in Ukraine, his actions are not so shocking. It's just it's in keeping with what we've seen in recent years. And is there a silver lining here? I mean, geopolitically, the silver lining, as I said, is that we've all come together, except for a few countries, a few world leaders. We've all come together. There's a sense of a global community again, which is encouraging. And related to that politically, is there a silver lining? Well, look, as I just mentioned, we have a crisis of leadership, a crisis of democracy that's been observed in the last decade. But look at what President Zelensky has managed to do. It is really remarkable. He's inspired us with his leadership during wartime. The fact that his country, his government, his citizens are really fighting for democracy in a way that has triggered an emotional chord in a lot of world leaders. And I think that's encouraging. Maybe there is an opportunity to regain political legitimacy, to regain the sense of shared democratic values, thanks to what President Zelensky has done. But the question is, can we retain that sense of unity around democracy and democratic values? I'm not sure, and I hate to be pessimistic, but it's the global risk sort of thinking in my mind that makes me feel this could be short-lived. But at least for now, this is a silver lining. We have renewed faith in leadership. It is possible. We have renewed faith in democratic values. It's just not coming from a major power. It's coming from a leader in a war-torn country. Next, I wanted to touch on this idea of the economic risk trends that are kind of, well, that President Putin has capitalized on. We know that the post-pandemic recovery is ongoing, okay? We know that we've been talking about a global debt crisis for many years now, and this challenge to globalization that has come from populists and economic nationalists. We also know that even before the pandemic, food prices were high, and that we were recurrently concerned about inflation. Obviously, the war in Ukraine and the sanctions imposed on Russia, the sort of disruption in the supply chain in wheat, in particular, Ukraine and Russia, I did not realize, provided 30% of wheat supply, apparently. It's put pressure on energy as we've cut off oil and gas from Russia. It's led to panic buying in places, in various countries in the Middle East, particularly Egypt, that imported quite a lot of wheat. Prices are going up, supplies are going down. We're all going to feel that pinch. And another statistic, over 50 countries rely on Russia, Ukraine for wheat, especially in countries in Africa and Asia. So we know that there will be a lot more suffering. But again, President Putin's actions are in keeping with existing negative economic risk trends. This has just made it much worse. And the UN's FAO has just announced that worldwide we're going to be facing a major food crisis. The World Food Programme's leadership has echoed similar sentiments. So it's hard to see a silver lining here. We already had such negative economic risk trends, and the pandemic has exacerbated the situation dramatically and in such a short period. Is there a silver lining in this scenario? Well, this wouldn't happen in the near term, but potentially this could encourage certain countries to be more self-sufficient. It could also, and there's been a lot of discussion about this recently by pundits, could this be the trigger that pushes more countries, more world leaders to pursue renewables, given that we've lost Russian oil and gas? Although, of course, we know that in the short term, world leaders are trying to find more oil and gas to deal with the more near-term effects. But it's really hard to see a silver lining here. And keeping in mind that a lot of these existing economic risks triggered protests and anti-government unrest in the Arab Spring region and in other parts of the world, we should expect to see more citizens getting up in frustration and challenging their governments because of this food crisis, because of this hunger crisis. It's hard to be optimistic here. But again, the only silver lining is that maybe this will be the trigger that will force us to pursue renewables more aggressively going forward. Lastly, we have to talk about the social elements. Obviously, I'm sure you've seen all the coverage. Devastating to see over 3 million Ukrainians flee their country as they're bombed. This is adding to an existing global refugee crisis that, frankly, we did not have a handle on even before this happened. You know, the usual suspects, refugees from Syria, from Myanmar, from Venezuela, Iraq, Afghanistan. So we were already in a pretty difficult position and not really having sufficient response. I mean, you know, I have a personal connection, for instance, to a refugee camp in Jordan. It's a long story, but basically I launched this memorial fund in honor of my late brother a few years ago, and have had a lot of interactions with some of the people there who are running the camp there and working specifically with Syrian refugee youth. But this is not a permanent solution. And now if you throw in additional 3 million refugees, and of course, as you know, there's been a there has been a sense of opening up their borders from countries like Poland. We've seen countries like Denmark reverse their immigration policies to allow more refugees from Ukraine to come in. It's encouraging. I think that's a sense of silver lining, that the world is not turning their back on Ukrainian refugees. And I believe it's 3 million overall, but maybe at least 40% or 30% are the problem is, again, what's happened in Ukraine, Putin's decision to invade, the invasion itself, and what we're seeing really is in keeping with some social trends, some social risk trends. This idea that, well, in the last decade, there's been a question mark. Are we globalists? Are we nationalists? Care about the other? I'm sure all of you are very much aware of the xenophobia, the hate that has proliferated in the last decade. It was manifested, it was also very visible in the pandemic period, where we saw a resurgence or in the emergence of xenophobia towards the East Asian community in certain Western countries. We saw a resurgence in hate against existing minority groups, for instance, in India, against Muslims in India, in Myanmar, against the Muslim minority. And well, the Ukraine invasion has again reminded us of this hate trend, of this social risk trend, because there's been a lot of criticism that why is the world so ready to support Ukrainian refugees when they've been less supportive of other refugees from other parts of the world. And frankly, and I'm sure you've seen some of the coverage, even some of the coverage of the refugee crisis has been laced with bias or, borderline xenophobia. I was reading, I think it was an article in the Independent, and they were talking about how, the journalist was talking about how shocking it was to see refugees who look like us, who have blue eyes, and live in a country a relatively civilized country where they watch Netflix, and to see all this unfolding. So it's definitely it's definitely a larger debate. Are we showing, as a global community, are we showing more support to refugees from this Western country versus what we've done with other refugee populations from other parts of the world? This idea of selective empathy. And additionally, with respect to the refugee population, there has been a lot of coverage about minority refugees from Ukraine, particularly students from India, from parts of Africa who have been studying in Ukraine. And when they tried to flee, like everybody else, they felt that they were discriminated against at the border. So again, Putin's actions, the events that have followed since the initial invasion, are in keeping with this social risk trends of xenophobia, of discrimination that we've observed in the last decade. So we shouldn't be so surprised of what has happened in terms of political trends, economic trends, social trends. And what I fear is that we're heading into a year which will probably be the angriest year yet for the average citizen. What I talk about in my next book as a global spring, where you will see more citizens who are frustrated with the economic conditions that are exacerbated not just by the pandemic, but by the Ukraine invasion, and also the social trends that I mentioned. So I wish I had more positive things to say, but really the Ukraine crisis has exacerbated the geopolitical, political, and economic risk trends that have been in during the pre-pandemic era in the last decade, and that were visible during the pandemic period, and are even more so visible during this period of war in Europe. So yeah, that's pretty much all I wanted to say. I wish I had more concrete judgments to make about how things will unfold. But I'm curious to hear what your take is, and of course I'm happy to take some questions since we have a bit of time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Assis.